Hi, this is Justin Colletti of SonicScoop, and today, thanks to our friends at FabFilter, we get to go super deep on EQ when it comes to mastering. In mastering, I'd argue that EQ is probably the most powerful tool that we have. And it's really not only in mastering, I'd say this is true of mixing as well. Things like compression get talked about a lot because they're so mysterious, and things like reverb and delay get talked about a lot because they're so obvious, but there's really nothing that can reshape a sound quite in the same way that an EQ can. And the way that we use EQ and think about EQ in mastering is a little bit different than the way you might think about in both tracking and mixing. Ideally, a mastering engineer is doing subtle amounts of EQ to your mix to just kind of perfect it and fine-tune it around the edges. But sometimes tracks can be significantly improved by getting a little bit more heavy-handed with EQ. We'll talk about why and how to do both, why and how to know when to do both, and what can go wrong with each of those approaches. We're going to also hear some examples together. I got some great tracks pulled up here from a couple of different artists, and I want to show you a couple of different examples taking EQ in pretty different directions. And I wanted to show that to you in a couple of different genres as well. But before we start hearing some of this stuff together, I got to give you some of the broad conceptual frameworks about using EQ in mastering. I'm going to be doing all of my EQ moves today with FabFilter's Pro Q3. It is a fabulous EQ. FabFilter make practically everything I'd need to master an entire track, and I've used nothing but FabFilter plugins here to master both of these tracks, trying to recreate the master I did for my clients using nothing but FabFilter plugins, and it came together really quickly, really easily. With just a few minutes of tweaking, I was able to get really, really close to my finished masters for both of these clients. And almost all the heavy lifting here is being done with Pro Q3 from FabFilter. Does everything I need it to do. It's got not only EQ, but dynamic EQ. It can do mid-side EQing and a whole lot more that we'll look at in pretty great detail as we get further along. Big thanks to FabFilter for making this one free to the public. I'm going to reveal some ideas and concepts and techniques to you that I've never revealed publicly before outside of my Mastering Demystified course. If you want the deep dive with me, check it out over at masteringdemystified.com. But if you want to get a lot of insights into EQ in mastering totally for free, that's what we're doing today. So big thanks to FabFilter for that. As mentioned, I think the most important thing to do before we start hearing these tracks and playing around with this EQ together is just to establish what are we trying to accomplish in mastering with EQ. And I'd say there's kind of three primary goals. And to achieve them, there's two general approaches to EQing. Our three primary goals are, one, when I'm mastering a record, I want to make sure that the finished mastered version of the record really stands up to the artist or the producer or the mixer's favorite records, that it feels like it belongs on the shelf with some of the best sounding records of their style, records that they're going to be comparing theirs to back to back. They should, when they get done with mastering, feel like, we did it. We made a record that sounds like a commercial release, that sounds like it could go on the radio or on a playlist next to some of our favorite releases. Goal number two is to make sure that the mix translates better to different environments. So the mixer who mixed the track may have been doing it in their room on somewhat compromised speakers, somewhat compromised acoustic environment, or maybe even on headphones. And they got it sounding as good as they could get it sounding. However, when they take that mix to other environments, to their car, to the club, to a friend's house, they listen on a different pair of headphones, all of a sudden things don't sound quite how they expected or intended for things to sound. So helping with translation from one system to another, making sure the record sounds the way that the mixer and the artist intended for it to sound, only hopefully even better, that's another big goal of mastering. And the third major overall goal in here is to get a better internal frequency balance, where we're potentially smoothing out really big peaks or really big dips and weak points in the overall frequency spectrum for that mix. And all three of these things, honestly, are so interrelated. And there's two broad approaches to going in there and EQing. Some of the EQing that I'll do is just trying to tilt it in the right direction. Is the track a little bit too bright or is it a little bit too dark? Do I need to add more low end Or do I need to take away some top end? Or I need to bring some more top end in? Is there too much mid-range or too little mid-range? And this overall tilt is a big and important part of mastering. But within that, there's a little bit more micromanaging specific areas. So you might have low frequencies where, say, a kick that's down around 60 hertz or 50 hertz isn't really giving you all the energy it should be giving you. Whereas there's this bass that's at 100 hertz or 80 hertz where it's really super dominant. And we need to bring those sub-low frequencies and those upper bass frequencies into better balance with one another. We may have a similar thing going on up higher in the frequency spectrum, where maybe our high is at 10K or 12K or a little overrepresented, and there's a bit of a dip maybe at 8K or 6K or 4K, and bringing those upper mids or low highs into balance with the high highs makes sense, and we're trying to kind of correct things there. So there's kind of the overall broader tilting and the more fine work of balancing one area of the frequency spectrum against another. This could also happen in the mid-range. Do we have a record that sounds a little too honky, a little too boxy? It's got too much 400 or 500 hertz going on in there, but it actually wants a little bit more kind of push coming out at 700 or 800 hertz. So we're trying to bring those into better balance. So those are the overall things that we're thinking about. But before we even get there, before we even touch a single knob on an EQ, when it comes to mastering, we gotta first decide which direction does it need to go, and what's the best way to figure that out. Well, it's listening to references, actual commercial releases that the artist, the producer, the mixer loves the sound of. The records that they're going to be, whether secretly or whether they're acknowledging it, they're going to be comparing their record back to back against to make sure it stands up to these records. You want to get those into your ear and say, how far are we away from our favorite releases in this style? And are there certain ways in which we're not living up to all of them? Are we a little bit darker than all of them? Then the answer is pretty clear. We want to brighten things up. Are we a little brighter and thinner than all of them? The answer is pretty clear. We want to darken them down or fatten them up a little bit. But what if we're kind of in the middle and some of our favorite releases sound a little brighter, some sound a little bit darker, some sound a little bit more mid-rangey than ours? How do we know which direction to go in then? That's an aesthetic choice. But the choice that I often make when there's some confusion about which direction to go is to first start off with, well, which style of production are we already closest to? Which would allow me to do the least? Maybe the mix is a little bit dark, but some of their favorite records also sound a little bit dark. Rather than emulate a really bright one, I'm going to get those darker ones into my ear more and say, maybe they had good insights in the mix. They decided which direction it should go already, and I'm going to let where the mix is now decide which direction we're going to go in. Whenever there's some real doubt, I'll sometimes send the client 2 different versions. I'll say, here's my first instinct. I thought this mix needed to be brightened up, but if you wanted to go in a darker, fatter direction, here's what that would sound like. And I like this approach because, in general, my goal with EQing and mastering is to EQ as little as possible. And that's what a lot of mastering engineers will tell you. The dream job when it comes to mastering is I'm just making little changes of a 0.5 dB or 1 dB here and there. And I almost feel guilty for charging the client because it's like, I finished mastering it, it sounds pretty close to what you gave me. Hopefully it sounds a little bit better, but I just try not to mess it up because it's great. Good thing you sent it to me instead of someone who would try to impress you and do a bunch of stuff to it. Awesome. We just have a record that sounds a lot like yours. I just made the low end sound a little more consistent from track to track and maybe brought in a little bit more sparkle or smoothed out the highs a little bit. And that's all we're doing, 0.5 dB of EQ. But things can also go in the other direction where there are some records where I have done 3 and 4 dB EQ changes to the low end, to the mids, to the highs, and the clients have been absolutely thrilled with the way it came back to them sounding in the end. And sometimes that heavy-handed type of EQ where I might be getting into the 3 and 4 dB of boost and cut, that might be exactly what the song needs. Now, when I am making changes that big, I'd say this is on the high side for EQing and mastering 3 and 4 dB changes. I'm often along with that giving notes to the client saying, hey, here's what I had to do to really get it in the same world as some of your favorite records. But if on future mixes you want to improve this even further, so I was doing less and less for you, you could just reapproach the way you're thinking about your kick drum on this track. There's maybe a little bit extra low frequency you didn't know was there. Or maybe there's a little bit too much 80 hertz in your bass that you probably couldn't hear in your room. You probably had a deficiency of 80 hertz in your room. So now you're boosting all of this 80 hertz in the bass, and you don't have to do that. I think that's your room kind of misleading you a little bit. And if anything, you could tuck down that 80 hertz and bring up your 60 hertz. This is just one theoretical example. For you and the idiosyncrasies in your room and on your headphones, those numbers may be totally different. But that's the kind of feedback that I might give to a client who's looking for feedback and where I have to make some pretty significant changes. The awesome thing about that approach is I've done this with a bunch of mastering clients, and the second time they send me a mix to master, it sounds way better. And they've taken so much of that into account. And now I'm only making 1 and 2 dB changes instead of 3 and 4 dB changes. And maybe they send me a third single or EP or album to work on, and they've taken a few more of my notes into account. And now I'm only making little half dB and 1 dB changes. And it's an absolutely awesome way to learn to mix even better, and to learn to hear and understand your mixing environment even better, to get that kind of feedback from a person who's in your corner, helping you out with this, helping you do the final QC in mastering. Now, there's only one more thing I want to tell you before we start listening to some tracks together. And that is that in all of the years that I've been doing mastering, and it's coming close to a decade now that I've been mostly focused on the mastering end of things, in the hundreds, thousands of tracks that have come in for me to work on, pretty much all of them just need one of 4 different things done to them when it comes to EQ. And this is big to recognize. Each track is unique, but there's really only 4 directions that you will ever go when it comes to EQ. I'll tell you what they are right now. And the most common one of them, EQ shape number 1 that you're likely to run into. This is probably 70% of mixes close to, this is the way they come in. They're a little bit too dark compared to favorite commercial releases, and they need to be brightened up a little bit. They will often have too much low end going on. Something is happening below 80 hertz, below 70 hertz, below 60 hertz, where there's just way more sub-frequency energy than there is on their favorite releases. And we need to control that a little bit. They're just not hearing all of this extra sub energy in their room, so they're not doing anything to control it quite like they should. On these releases that are a little too dark and want to be brightened up, you're often, in addition to, taking down some lows, could be below 60 hertz, could be below 100 hertz, you're often bringing down some of the lower mids where practically every instrument puts out some energy, and you're most likely to get this kind of murky, boxy quality. So cutting out the low mid somewhere between 200 and 600 hertz, somewhere in there, one or more spots, often is something that's going to help open up the mix and make it feel just a little bit more impressive, a little bit fuller on bottom and clearer on top in a nice way. And then the third thing that's likely to happen on these is you're likely going to find something in the upper mid-range or in the high frequencies or both that wants to be boosted just a little bit to give a little bit more detail, a little bit more clarity, a little bit more brightness. So that is most common thing number 1 you're going to do to mixes. They're a little bit too dark. They want to be brightened up overall. There's a subtle variation on this one that's probably another one of the more common things to happen, and that is a mid-rangey mix. And the difference to me between a mid-rangey mix and a dark mix is that a mid-rangey mix, in addition to being too dark on top and not having all the detail and clarity it needs, it's going to be a little bit light in the bottom end as well. So this is a mix where stuff in the lows and the subs below 100 hertz, below 60, that stuff is underrepresented. And you just have an overall kind of thin and small sounding record that's not really impressive. It doesn't have any bombast. It doesn't have this kind of big, larger than life feel to it that you might want depending on the kind of style that you're working in. So on these tracks, it's more your job to do a little bit of a smiley face thing where we're bringing up some lows, potentially some subs, also bringing up some highs, and maybe cutting some mid-range as well. So that's a subtle variation, number 2. Number 3, and this one is becoming a little bit more common, and this is the flip side of that, mixes that are too bright, too thin, where you're probably controlling the top end a little bit. There's probably something poking out in the highs or the high mids that you need to just soften a little bit. To a degree, this might happen with fast attack compressors or de-essers or dynamic EQs that are going to smooth out some overabundant high frequencies from high frequency instruments, often high percussion. And you might also be adding some low end, bringing in some bottom, and maybe even pushing the mid-range forward a little bit more. Maybe that area of 200 to 500 hertz, you don't need to cut it. Maybe they cut a little bit too much in mixing and things are sounding a little thin and a little weak and lacking a little bit of personality and realism, and bringing back some of those mids or low mids might be exactly the thing to do. All right, so that's number 3. Number 4, and this one is becoming increasingly common these days. This is the mix that is too hyped up, that's already too scooped sounding, that has tons of lows, tons of highs. They were clearly doing a lot in the mix, and maybe even with some mix bus EQ to try to get those big bottom ends and big top end going and to make things sound really impressive. But then when you compare it to some of their favorite records, it really doesn't have the same kind of forward mid-range that you might expect in their style. This is something that happens quite a bit with newer rock mixers who get a little bit of EDM envy, where maybe they're listening to some electronic tracks or pop tracks and hearing, oh man, that bottom end is so big and that top end is so sparkly and I got to make my track sound impressive like that too. So they really start goosing those lows and those highs. But when they actually listen to the record, next to the records it's supposed to belong in the same world with, they find that, man, it doesn't actually sound like my favorite rock records. My favorite rock records actually have a lot more mid-range. And here I am in the mix, really accentuating the bottom end of the kick drum and the sizzle on top of cymbals. But in my favorite records, there's like this forward, aggressive mid-range thing happening where the guitars come forward more and the drums take a little bit of a back seat. And in this context, when things are a little bit overhyped or overscooped, you might be actually reducing low frequencies and high frequencies and bringing mid-range forward. And one of the things that often happens when you do this is things like drums start to come back in the mix just a tiny bit, and things like guitars and vocals come forward in the mix just a little bit. If you're the kind of person who likes, really loud, bombastic drums, this might sound like a bad thing. Like, I worked really hard to get people to hear my kick drum and my snare and make my drum sound impressive. And it's like, that's great, but you can push that too far to the place where all of a sudden your record doesn't sound like the kind of record it is. And all of a sudden, the things that end listeners actually really care about in that record, so much of the personality and storyline of the record that's happening in the mid-range, that stuff kind of disappears and wants to be brought back forward. So this is a kind of counterintuitive thing that you sometimes have to do in mastering, where someone during the mix almost tried to master the record while they were mixing and just took it a little bit too far in that polished, hyped up direction, and you've just got to reel in some of the excesses a little bit. Now, for any of these scenarios, the changes that we're talking about could be really small, or they could be really significant. A small amount of EQ might be a half dB or 1 dB. A medium amount of EQ might be 1 to 2 dB. A significant, really heavy-handed amount of EQ might be 3 or 4 dB. But whether it's a lot of EQ or just a little bit of EQ, these are really the only 4 directions that you're ever going to end up taking a track in. Maybe there's some exception to this. Let me know in the comments down below if you can think of one. The only one I can think of is it needs so little that I can't even fit into one of these categories and I barely need to EQ it at all. But even in the case of tracks that just need a little bit of EQ, you're probably EQing in one of these 4 basic directions. All right, I think that's enough talk about the principle and theory of EQ. I think it's now time to get into hearing some tracks together. Let's have a listen. All right, we've got a couple of different tracks here to listen to, and I've done two different mastering approaches on each of these. These tracks, I've selected both of them because I'm doing a, somewhat significant amount of EQ, 1 to 2 dB in a lot of places where you're going to hear, substantial changes before and after. But it's not a ton of EQ because these were already really good mixes to begin with. They just need to be kind of pushed in the right direction. Now, I didn't want to pick some where I only needed to do like little half dB changes in EQ because then it's just not going to be as informative. But each of these mixes, if you're in this situation where 1 and 2 dB changes are being applied in mastering, you probably have a pretty good mix, and you're probably going to be pretty happy with the results you're getting back from a mastering engineer. This first one is a song called Sunshining by an artist called Woodz Deep. Guy named Danny Woodrow who produces his own electronic tracks. There's a lot of vocal samples going on in this stuff. And I thought this song had a really fun chorus that we could put on loop and not get tired of listening to several times in a row here. First, I'll play you the before, and then I will play you the master that I did for him. It's going to get a little bit louder when we hear this after, but after you get that initial sense of where the track started out and where it wound up, we'll go ahead and level match everything so we can just focus in on the EQ changes without being led astray by changes in volume. So here's the before of Sunshining from Woodz Deep. Here we go. So I think you can hear the track opens up a lot, gets a lot brighter and clearer, and also it gets substantially louder. But I always like to do that initial not level match back and forth because that's often how the artist or the producer experiences hearing their master for the first time. They're hearing that jump in volume. So I want you to be cognizant that some of how radical that changes will go away once we start to level match things, but it'll still be significant. Now, this is one of those tracks that ended up wanting to go in a brighter direction. You might think that the original mix here sounds good if you just listen to it by itself. And it does. It's a good mix. Internally, things are well balanced against one another. And it's not like crazy way too dark. But if you listen to this record next to this actual artist's favorite records, it's a little bit darker and murkier than just about all of them, with a little bit extra kind of bottom end and a little bit less top end and a little less detail than almost all the records that I was listening to as references. Again, not crazy far off, but far off enough to need a couple of dB of EQ in a couple of key places. Now let's listen to these before and afters level matched. I have everything in this session here going at about -12 LUF, so we're not hearing a ton of limiting. On this track, I'm not even applying any compression. We're just listening to what the fabfilter Q3 EQ is doing to these tracks with a tiny touch of limiting, so we're not swayed too much by changes in dynamics. On the actual master I did for the client, I did some more compression. We'll do a deep dive on compression and mastering a little later on, but for today, we just want to really hear these EQ differences. So let's listen to these level matched now. You'll hear the before and then the after. And then after I bring up the mastered version, I'll open up the EQ so you can see as well as hear what's going on. All right, here we go. All right, so on the Pro Q3, these changes look fairly significant, but like I said, they're all around 2 dB for the most part, and sometimes less. There's a little bit of a half dB boost happening below 70 hertz. And this roll-off, which looks pretty significant, is just happening below 24 hertz. So really all of our meaningful content starts about up here in the let's say 40 to 50 hertz range. And stuff below 40 to 50 hertz, and particularly below 24 hertz, is being rolled off to some degree. The most significant changes here that are actually making the track sound brighter aren't actually brightening EQs. They're these little dips in the mid-range and in the lows. And I have a few of them going on. There's this one dip here. It's actually close to 3 dB at 136 hertz. There was one low-frequency instrument that was sticking out a little bit too much for me. And bringing that down tightened things up a little bit and made the high frequencies open up a little bit more. There's also a trio of little cuts happening in 3 low mid-range areas. They're happening at 280, 409, and 530. And on tracks that are a little bit darker than the reference tracks and want to go a little bit brighter, it's common for me to cut one or more of these areas. It might be 250 or 280, somewhere in there, the 200 to 300 range. And then there might be another cut in the 500 range. In this case, there's 3 cuts, one in that 200 to 300 range, one in the 400 range, one in the 500 range. And that's just what this one needed to open up a little bit more. But I'd say that using 3 cuts in this area is a little bit less common, but it did work for this track. And an alternative to making 3 cuts here might have been to make just 2 cuts in the lower mids and do an additional boost in the upper mids. On this track, I'm actually rolling off some high frequencies. Because we're taking down the level of some of the lows and some of the low mids, the top got a little bit brighter. So I wanted to add a little bit more control to the top end. So there's a little bit less than a dB cut going on above 6200 hertz. But still, I think there was a little bit more control left to do in both the lows and the highs, especially after doing some significant 2 dB cuts in the low mids. I wanted to take some of these high areas that were poking out a little bit too much and some of the low end that wasn't as controlled as I'd like it to be and tamp those down a little bit further. So I did that with a second instance of EQ here, which is actually a dynamic EQ. This is the same EQ, Pro Q3, just has a dynamic EQ mode. But what it's going to do in dynamic EQ mode is it's only going to really cut as much as it could when frequencies get kind of past the threshold. So it's a kind of intensity dependent EQ cut. So you could end up doing a cut here at 7,500 hertz or here at about 12K, but have those cuts only really happen when the offending instruments that are just a little bit too bright are at their most active, and they can be doing less at other times. So this way you're not so much darkening the track up overall, but you're doing a little bit more of a targeted darkening. I also have a little bit of reshaping going on here in the lows, where there is another dynamic EQ happening in this 120, 130 hertz area, but it's not happening all the time, just when this instrument is at the most overbearing. And I'm actually doing the opposite down here at 60 hertz. I'm using a little bit of upward expansion. So when that kick drum hits, we add a little bit more sub, but only to that kick drum when it's hitting. And we're not adding 60 hertz all the time. Just when 60 hertz starts to get a little bit intense in that kick drum, we just give it a little bit of an extra goose to kind of bring the sub frequencies and the low frequencies into better balance, bringing up the subs a hair more and bringing down the lows a tiny bit. Let's hear the before and after, and then we'll hear it toggling on and off this dynamic EQ. Here we go, the before. So you'll see this EQ is bringing down a little bit of the high frequency energy in those hi-hats. And it's also bringing down some of the high frequency on that big snare when it hits to make the snare a little bit fatter than it was before. Aside from this, the only thing I put on this little test master I did real quickly with Pro Q3 is just a little bit of their Saturn saturator. And there is the option to apply additional EQ here, but I'm not using it right now. This is softening and smoothing the top end just a little bit more. We could also take this change even further. Let me copy this over from our A EQ to our B EQ. And now when I switch to B, I'll take down even more of this high frequency stuff, and then we can compare that to the A that we had earlier. So let's play around with lowering the range of the dynamic EQ and the high frequencies and hear what that sounds like. And we could even change this from just operating in stereo mode to operating in mid-side. So now we're focusing on curtailing the high frequencies, but more in the sides than in the mids. Let's hear what that might sound like. Here's how we had it before on A, and then I'll switch to B, which is just slightly darker top end. Let's hear that. And hopefully you can hear how that is curtailing a little bit of the high frequencies in the sides and just making things sound a little bit smoother, a little bit warmer, a little bit darker. And I'm making a pretty significant boost here of about 5, almost 6 dB, but because it's being done as a dynamic EQ just in the sides, it's not as destructive or as obtrusive as it would be if I was just trying to EQ this thing normally with more of a conventional EQ. But to be honest, for this track, if you actually listen to the original references, this slightly brighter approach probably sounds a little closer to a lot of the favorite records that this particular artist was referencing. And I actually did an even brighter version of this master for him. And that's what we have here on this third track. The first one's our original. The second one here is a master that went a little bit brighter. And the third one here is a master that went even brighter still. And this sounds closer to some of the records he was referencing. And this was a just in case kind of thing where I sent a version where I said, if you wanted to go even brighter still, like this one record you were talking about, this is what it would sound like. And in this case, I think it was probably a little bit too far. But you'll hear in this third version that the low frequencies are even more controlled. And we're doing a 4 dB cut around 130. And to make up for some of this extreme cutting in the lows, I'm actually doing a significant boost here, right around 800 hertz, to bring back some of the body and warmth. And because the top end comes up when you end up doing cutting in the lows, I'm doing a little almost 2 dB cut in the higher frequencies between 7 and 8,000 hertz. Let's hear all three of these back to back. Here's the original. So any of these three approaches could potentially sound okay. The original mix doesn't sound bad, but I think if you listen to it next to this artist's favorite records, you're going to find it a little bit dark, a little bit muffled, whereas this middle one really sounds appropriate. It just sounds a little bit more open, a little bit more clear. We could debate and do a little bit of fine tuning to say, do we have exactly the right amount of low end? Are we hearing slightly too much of the hi-hats? Let's go ahead and spend a few more minutes figuring out whether there should be, 1.5 dB booster cuts versus 1 dB booster cuts in those areas. So we could still quibble about the extreme lows and the extreme highs. And on a final master, that's exactly what I would do. This is something I've done really quickly for demonstration purposes, just using a couple of quick plugins. On my actual final master for the client, there are probably a few more plugins than this going on, and you can check out finished versions, my actual masters for each of these clients on their artist pages. I'll be sure to link to those down in the descriptions below. But now that we've demonstrated this idea of taking a track in a slightly brighter direction, I want to show you something that's the exact opposite. Taking a track where the mix was already good, but it was maybe slightly bright compared to where this artist's favorite records were. This next track, called Animals, is from an artist called Sebastopol. A guy named Phil Millo sent this one to me. This one was produced and mixed by a very accomplished dude named Mick Glossop. He's worked with Frank Zappa, Public Image Limited, Van Morrison, and a whole bunch more. And the mixed relationships in this track, Animals by Sebastopol, really came out very nicely. But this was one of those cases where I felt like the mix was just a tiny shade brighter and just a little bit more top-end focused than some of the favorite records and favorite artists that this band was referencing. So let's hear the before and after on this one. This time I'll start with the tracks level matched. I'll play you my original and then one where I went significantly darker with it. And then one where it's a little bit more in between, where I didn't push it quite as dark. To show you that, again, there's more than one direction you can go with a master. And this first mastered version, track number 5 here, is really going to smooth out the top end some and just bring the lows and low mids back a little bit more in a way that just makes it sound fuller, thicker, and totally works for the track. But it is a little bit further from the mixer's original vision. So I also have this one that kind of splits the difference a little bit and stays a little bit brighter than some of the artist's references, but kind of respects the original flavor and approach of the mix just a little bit more. So let's hear all 3 of these approaches, starting with the original, then the darker, then the in-between, and then we'll look at what's going on with the EQs here. All of these are roughly level matched. I think we're around -11 LUFS on each of these. Here we go. So there, I think you hear this one getting quite a bit fatter, which is the exact opposite of what we're doing to the prior track, because that's the direction in which a lot of the kind of related music was sitting. And it also brings forward, even more importantly, the things that are more important in the mix. We're taking back some of those high hi-hats that are a little bit too prevalent for this style, maybe in the original mix, and just giving a little bit more girth overall and giving it the feeling of just being a little moodier by having it be a little fatter and a little darker like this. Let's go back and hear the same passage again, this time switching between the main one and one where I'm kind of splitting the difference between these 2 approaches. Here we go. And the kinds of things I'm doing to achieve this fattening are really relying a bit more heavily on some cuts to the high frequencies. Here around 13K, we're coming down by just between a dB and a dB and a half. And then everything above 18K is brought down by a little more than a dB and a half. Here, there's two cuts in the low mids happening, one at 550, just about, and one at round about 280. And then there's ever so slight of a lift here happening to frequencies below 200 hertz, with a tiny bit of roll off of frequencies below 38 hertz. Again, I have a little bit of dynamic EQ going on in this one. Again, trying to target just the hi-hats here a little bit. There's a little bit of fast attack compression to swallow up some of the brightness, but we're not focusing on that too much right now. What is cool to look at, though, is this Saturn saturator. We're adding a little bit of tape saturation. The mix here is just over 70%. But we're using the EQ here to bring down the high frequency band some, and also to roll off some of the extreme lows a little bit. So this one is actually doing quite a lot of heavy lifting on this particular track. Let's hear this chorus again with and without this Saturn. So that really smooths out the top end. And this track is darker than the original and maybe a little bit darker too than the prior master that we did where we wanted to go in a slightly brighter direction. But both of these masters, even though we're taking one a little brighter and one a little darker, are going a little closer to the kind of happy medium that we're finding for this track. Let's listen again on the chorus, but this time to the kind of in-between approach that I took, where we're being a little bit more subtle with the EQ. But interestingly, you'll notice on this first main EQ, we're doing the same kinds of cuts. There's actually a little bit more of a low mid cut going on here. And there's actually about the same cut happening in the high frequencies. The biggest difference here is that I'm not doing nearly as much swallowing of the high frequencies with the Saturn tape saturator on this one. And there's also this multiband EQ doing the same kind of thing as before, but in addition to tightening up the high frequencies, we're also tightening up some of the low frequencies just a little bit, right around 70 hertz, to keep the bottom end from getting too boomy. But a cool option I have to add on to this one is this Pro Q3, where I'm trying something fairly radical just to show you how powerful EQ can be used. In this case, it can be used as a stereo widening tool. What we have going on here is a little bit of a boost around 5K and a little bit of a boost around 10K. But the 5K boost is happening on the right channel, and the 10K boost is happening on the left channel. So we're boosting different frequencies differently on each side. Then we have this high frequency lift that's happening to all frequencies above 1K, but it's only happening on the sides and not in the middle. Same thing with the lows. We're taking everything below 100 hertz down a little bit, but just on the sides. And so that we're not bringing those cymbals back up too much with these different left and right boosts, there's a big dip here going on around 14K, but just in the sides. These are some pretty radical EQ moves and not the kind of thing I normally do in mastering. But because I wanted to master a track using nothing but FabFilter plugins, and practically the only thing FabFilter doesn't make is a stereo enhancer, I thought I'd get creative and try to recreate stereo enhancement using just Pro Q3. And it kind of works. I'll play you this before and after with this bypassed, and then I will put it in. So when you see me toggle this plugin on, we're adding the stereo enhancement. Here's the original. Here's the master that's darker than the original, but slightly brighter. And it'll get a little brighter and wider still when I unbypass this. Do you hear how the new mastered version with these EQ changes just feels a little bit less hollow, a little bit more thick and full? But unlike the other even darker master, it's not muting things too much. It's not making them too murky, too moody. We're respecting the original version of the mix a little bit more while giving it just a little bit more kind of oomph. Now, let's hear this master brightened up even a little bit further still when I turn on this makeshift stereo enhancement I'm doing with the Pro Q3 plugin. It's going to brighten up a little bit more, but get a little wider too. Let's hear that original, version 2 of the master, and then with the widening. I hope you hear how some of that mid-range starts to come forward a little bit more in this mastered version, whether with or without this makeshift stereo enhancer applied. To me, the mastered version has an overall better feel, but it also makes the vocal and the guitars come forward and take center stage a little bit more and makes those hi-hats take a little bit more of a back seat, so they're not overwhelming the more important elements of the mix too much. I think we hear a pretty similar thing happening in a verse section. And here, I think the bass will start to come out a little bit more too, so you can follow that line along a little bit better, which is so important in the verse section. Here's the original. Yeah, so to me, it just gets a little bit fuller and a little bit smoother without losing detail. We're getting a little darker and a little thicker, but in a way that's letting us hear what's happening in the track even better. So this is an interesting thing that happens when going darker is the right choice. Sometimes you end up bringing some more detail out of the track rather than less. Making things brighter in the top end isn't the only way to get more detail. And if a lot of the brightness in the track is being wasted on elements that aren't as important, say like hi-hats in this particular track, it stops your ear from focusing on the details that are more important, in this case, things like the bass, the guitar, and the vocals. So that's always fun and interesting when it can happen, making something fatter and more detailed at the same time. Whereas in the other track, we went a little bit brighter and a little bit more detailed at the same time. An interesting thing that happens, though, is if we listen to the masters, both the one we went brighter with and the one that we went darker with, they both wound up in a roughly similar place where they sound good next to one another. So in both cases, whether we went brighter or whether we went darker, they ended up feeling better balanced overall and a better fit with one another. Let's hear that. Here's the chorus to the Woodz Deep track, mastered version. And here's the chorus to the Sebastopol track, mastered version as well. So isn't that interesting? Even though we went brighter with one track and darker with another, they were both going in the same direction towards a kind of golden mean in the middle. Now, this golden mean is not like an exact line where you want to wind up. There's this whole range of acceptable options for where a master could go. And the slightly brighter version of the first master and the slightly darker version of the second master were both within the realm of reason. And the artist could have picked those and been totally happy. But as a general rule, I think you're often going to be most happy with the master when it kind of respects the original version of the mix and goes in the right direction without trying to go as far as possible in that right direction, just to match some other reference. Now, in the real world, some masters will have even less EQ than this. Like I said, some of my favorite projects to work on, I'm just making half dB changes, maybe dB changes, and almost feel guilty that I'm not significantly changing the result of the record. And those don't necessarily make the most sense to be the ones to present in a video about hearing EQ changes. But sometimes, yeah, in mastering, we could be doing half as much or less as we are here. But there are also some cases where I have bent the knobs around backwards for a client and they've been thrilled with the result. Sometimes because they lack the confidence to really go in the mix and be heavy-handed in the right places and make a few key, bold choices. And in particular, I've had clients in the electronic world or the hip-hop world who've heard the advice way too often of don't EQ too much, don't compress too much, and they get these kind of slightly flat and lifeless feeling mixes that aren't hyped up like their favorite releases. And then I go in there and mastering and hype them up a little bit, and maybe I'm doing 3 and 4 and more dB changes to EQ. But I find those are the exceptions more than the norm. And usually when I'm doing that much, it's a great learning experience for the producer or the mixer. And they often get more bold and more thoughtful and more intentional with their mixes in the future. Well, I hope that this look at the concepts, theory, and practice of applying EQ in mastering was useful to you. Big thanks and shout out to FabFilter for letting us crack open Pro Q3, which is really one of the best EQs out there. It's one of the most popular among serious mixers for good reason. And it has everything that I'd need in it for a mastering EQ as well. We've only scratched the surface of what it can do. You can boost, cut, change between a variety of different types of filters. You can set each of these filters to different shapes and slopes. With a click of a button, you can change between left, right, stereo, mid, and side EQing. You can turn it into a dynamic EQ. You can go ahead and very quickly and easily invert the gain, giving you the exact opposite of what you were doing originally. You can use this split feature here to duplicate the selected EQ band, making 2 identical copies, one operating only on the left and the other on the right, or one on mid and the other on the side. So we can EQ left and right separately, or sides and mid separately at the click of a button. You can make a whole bunch of significant EQ changes super quickly. And then here's one of my favorite features, quickly scale them up or down, increasing or reducing how much of a change you've made. This is an absolutely great way to use an EQ, to go in and make a bunch of bold choices that are definitely taking you in the right direction, and be unafraid to go a little bit too far with it, because you can always dial those changes you've made back down. You can easily cycle through each of the different EQ points you've made, copy your settings from an A to a B setting, make some tweaks here in B, and now toggle back and forth between the A and B version of your EQ to hear which one sounds better in real time. Right now, we've been using it in a 0 latency mode, but you can also do it in this natural phase or linear phase mode. Like so many of the FabFilter plugins, it's just so intuitive and easy to use, but deep and flexible and powerful at the same time. I really love it when plugin companies make tools where it doesn't seem like a lot of controls, so you're not overwhelmed, but when you go deep under the hood, there's so many different options in here. It's just easily among the best EQs ever designed. So if you haven't tried out Pro Q3 yet, you've got to. Go over to fabfilter.com where you can try out this or anything else they make totally for free for 30 days. Also, a big shout out and thanks to the artists. Woodz Deep, Danny Woodrow, for allowing us to hear this track, Sun Shining. A lot of fun. He's got a lot of really cool electronic tracks that I've had a lot of fun mastering. And also big thanks to the band Sebastopol. You'll definitely want to hear this track, Animals, in its entirety as well. And like I said, these were quick recreations of my masters using nothing but FabFilter plugins. But in very limited time, honestly, just a few minutes tweaking around with EQs, I could make them sound pretty darn close to the final masters I got, where I used probably twice as many tools on them to get them sounding the way that I did. Could I use nothing but FabFilter tools to master tracks? Absolutely. The only thing I'm potentially missing is a dedicated stereo enhancement plugin and kind of mono maker style plugin. But as you could see, I could kind of fake that kind of effect using Pro Q3 pretty creatively. Outside of that, give me Pro Q3, give me their compressor, which we'll look at in some more detail, and give me their limiter, which we have looked at in more detail. I'll link to a video I did on loudness and limiting with FabFilter here as well, so you can check that out, where I mastered a whole bunch of other tracks using nothing but FabFilter plugins, if you want to hear some of this stuff applied to some additional genres as well. So big thanks to the artists. Check out their pages. Big thanks to FabFilter. Get their free trial if you haven't tried their stuff already over at fabfilter.com. Big thanks to you for hanging out with me. If you want more from me, we've got a whole bunch of great free videos right here on this channel. Remember to hit like, subscribe, hit that notifications bell. And if you want to go even deeper, we've got the full-length course, Mastering Demystified, where I show you everything that I know about mastering. Thanks again for hanging out with me. This has been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. See you next time.